Welcome to the Clear to Send podcast, a podcast about wireless engineering, where we educate you on Wi-Fi technology, talk about design tips, troubleshooting, interviews, and the tools. Here are your hosts, Roel and Francois.
Hey everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. This is the first episode of 2019, and we're glad to have our other co-host, Francois Vergès. How are you doing, Francois?
Very good. Hi, Roel. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. And we also have a special guest on the show, Mr. Scott Lester. How are you doing?
I'm good, guys. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on the show. Happy New Year to you as well. Hopefully you're already having a great New Year.
I'm trying. We'll see what unfolds in 2019. Looks to be another busy year.
Yeah, I'm counting down the days until I break my resolutions already, so we'll see.
Yeah, I think I read something earlier about that. I think 2 weeks into February is about how long the average resolution lasts. So,
oh man,
that's pretty good.
I'm right there with you to see how long I can keep mine going.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us on the show, and I know you and I have met. I think the first time was at Mobility Field Day, and we met we've been communicating over Twitter for a while, and finally got to meet in person, and then we met again at Wi-Fi Trek. So I mean, that was great to finally meet someone different that I haven't met at the other conferences, which I don't go to a lot of conferences. But why don't you introduce yourself, Scott? Let everyone know who you are and what you do.
Okay. Well, I don't know how I feel about being called different. I hope that's different in a good way. But
different in a good way, it is.
But my name is Scott Lester. I am a CWNE. Have been for, going on a little over a year and a half now, I think. Number 253. Of course, I'm one of those people that I don't think the number really matters, right? It's more about getting the cert and improving and increasing your knowledge daily after that. So, but I work for Layer 3 Communications out of Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you that are familiar with the Atlanta area, we're actually based in Norcross, Georgia, which is just a stone's throw from downtown Atlanta. But I am a senior systems engineer for Layer 3. I've been there now for 4 years, and I typically specialize in wireless, specifically more along the lines of warehouses, stadiums, the typical large public venue type environments are what I typically work in. Not to say that there aren't some other, use cases and all that I dabble in here and there, but those are kind of my primary focuses for Layer 3.
Awesome. And how did you get started in wireless?
How I got started in wireless? Good question. I actually have a biology degree, which is a little bit interesting. I'm sure I've already perked a few of the listeners, brains as to how a guy with a biology degree gets into IT. But forever, I told myself that computers were my hobby, and I was not going to do anything related to computers for a professional career. Here we are, fast forward now, let's see, 11 years since I graduated, and you see what I'm doing, right? So we see how well the original plan worked out in college, but I got a job working for an IT help desk my sophomore year in college, and just really enjoyed the work. Was fortunate enough to be at a company that had some good people working there and all. And lo and behold, about probably a month before my college graduation, a guy walks up to me and he introduces himself and he says, "Hey, I'm so-and-so." And I was like, "Okay, I'm familiar with you. You're the director of IT, blah, blah, blah." And long story short, got a job offer for a full-time systems administrator position. And then kind of just the IT career took off, right? Went from that role as a system administrator for a few years into working as a network analyst at a university in Southern Alabama, typically doing a lot around wired and wireless at the time. Moved from that into a career at Aruba Networks, now affectionately known as Fortaroo. And after working there for a few years, traveling the globe as a field support escalations team member, found my way over to Layer 3. So I guess you would say that's kind of the career path, if you will, but the journey into wireless really started probably back in high school, working at a hardware store as my first job. And it's one of those things, hired as a stock boy again, and fortunes changed, and they found out I knew a little bit about computers. And from there, I worked on my first wireless network, with air quotes, right? With a Orinoco Lucent Technologies WaveLAN access point. So that was the initial dive off into wireless, and fast forward now all those years later, and here we are.
Wow. I mean,
That's interesting.
It's quite the career path, and very similar to mine, where I actually started in IT help desk as well, and then moved into systems administration and made my way into networking. And when you're doing networking, you kind of it's there's a lot to take in, right? When it comes to networking, you got routing, switching, security, and then I just kind of fell into the wireless section, and that's where I like to be. So I mean, it's a good career path in my opinion, because you know what's involved in a lot of different steps, from how the users interact with the network down to how the systems interact with the network, and then actually doing network engineering. And as wireless, you kind of have the whole gamut, right? The full stack, as you say, to really understand how things work.
Yeah, you really do. And, for those in the audience that are listening, it's not that I would advocate always pursuing that career path to get into wireless networking. But like you said, Roel, it's definitely been one that has provided a lot of background knowledge and understanding to help improve my skills as a wireless engineer, being able to understand that lower level, switching and routing that you kind of really can't have a wireless network without these days, right? So.
Yeah, and I like to use that as a way of not pointing. You know how people point fingers, right? It's always a network.
Absolutely.
And I always like to point a finger back, but then add a little tip, going, "Hey, did you check this on your server?" And then because that information, they come back, and usually it's silence, and then all you get is, "It works now."
Yeah, I can remember several of those moments, especially on the escalation side, working at Maru, where I would drop into a customer site, network's burning down, has been down more than it's been up, and you're looking around and you're like, "Hey, Mr. Customer, can you also check this in the background while I'm trying to figure out what's going on over here?" And then they come back to you, right? And all of a sudden it's like, "Hey, the network's working." Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's good. That's awesome.
Yeah. What did you do? I didn't touch anything. We'll just leave it as it is. It's working.
Yeah. The ghost of many networks, both in the past and in the future, I'm sure.
Yeah. I'm sure we all have our own stories, from the horrors, but I guess we could leave that for another episode. How about you talk about your experience with Mobility Field Day? Because you and I were both at Mobility Field Day 3. What did you think about that as a first-timer delegate?
I think my head may still be spinning. I'm not sure that I've quite gathered all of the information, and still here we are, several months after that. But just truly, the entire experience was just truly an exceptional venture for myself, especially being my first one. Obviously, like you said, we had conversed, out offline, and then, knowing several of the other delegates, I think made it a little more inviting, a little more comfortable. But, we talk about it several times. The wireless community, it truly does, embody the community spirit, right? I mean, we talk on Twitter all the time. We talk on Slack all the time. And there's several of us, globally that have never met each other face to face, but yet, we're good friends when we finally do meet at an event like Trek or Mobility Field Day or some of the conferences that are, going on month to month. But it was just a unique experience in the fact that you're able to work and learn from so many different people, both delegates and, presenters of the various companies that are participating in the field day. And then, just quite frankly, you're exposed to so much so fast. It really does kind of create that head spinning effect. But fortunately for the guys over at Tech Field Day, they were, smart enough to record everything and put it out there so that we can go back after the fact and continue to enjoy those videos and learn from those as we proceed down our career paths and all. But just a very unique experience, and I would highly recommend it to anyone if you're interested in if you're a fan of Tech Field Day, if you watch the videos or the live streams and all like that, go to the website, fill out the form. I'm sure you would gather as much out of it as I did.
Yeah, anyone could I guess nominate themselves to become a delegate. I think one of the prerequisites for that is you have to maintain a blog or some sort of online presence, and then that could be through Twitter, for example, which many of the wireless people are through Twitter, and they have their own blogs and their own podcasts, for example. And I would say Mobility Field Day, the guys that run it, Tech Field Day, it's one of my favorite events, only because you get into this intimate setting with not only the presenters, but also with the other delegates. So you really get to know the other delegates really well because they transport you in the same vehicle. You have the same dinners with them. You have the same drinks with them. So you're staying in the same hotel. So you're really getting to know all of the delegates very well. And then you end up just becoming very good friends with them, even the ones that come from different countries. So it is quite the experience. And yes, after the whole event, your head just hurts because you've just been given so much information. And luckily, we do get to see the videos. They post the videos very quickly, so we can go back and reference them for when we present that to you guys, the listeners, and anyone else who wasn't able to attend. You get everyone's different opinions or their different standpoints on how this technology works or even how it doesn't, right? And that's what's so great about delegates is they're not afraid to speak what's on their mind. And I think that's what's so good about that event.
Absolutely. It's summer camp for Wi-Fi guys at Mobility Field Day anyway.
I have a question for Scott. You worked for, I didn't know actually you worked for Meru, but going back to Mobility Field Day, what did you think of the Fortinet presentation, especially the one on single channel architecture with just, the experience you have now with your new job? Like, do you see the technology differently, or what did you think of the overall presentation?
That's a good question. It brought back a lot of old memories. Actually, one of the presenters was a former colleague of mine while I was working at Meru, so it was good to catch up with him after the fact. All these years later now. But as far as seeing the technology differently, I wouldn't say necessarily that I saw it differently. Obviously during the time that I was at Meru was kind of I'll call it the existential crisis, right? Where networks were really starting to explode with all types of devices, IoT and laptops, cell phones, whatever, right? It really was at just at the cusp of that initial onslaught of devices just a few years ago, back in 2012, really. And, it's grown exponentially since then, right? But it was exciting to see how they're continuing to grow off of the Meru technology, and I hope that there are still plans to continue forward with that. Dr. Bhargavan, the gentleman that was responsible for a lot of the initial work at Meru and the initial theories and all like that, just an extremely exceptional dude, very, very intelligent. I think one of the ways that you can kind of reinforce that fact about how intelligent and how smart he actually was when it comes to technology and wireless in specific is the principle of being able to use a wireless controller as a type of air traffic control, if you will, by, utilizing a single beacon out of multiple access points and all like that, and then spacing everything out across the spectrum via time, almost like, time splicing, if you will, was just unique. And it was so unique at the time that it actually stirred up a lot of controversy amongst many of the incumbent wireless vendors of the time, right? The Arubas, the Ciscos, and so forth, to the point there were many accusations made that the technology actually violated the 802.11 standard, right? And I think, anytime you can present something that stirs up so much controversy as that premise did early on in the days of Maru, you definitely know you've got something. And then if you can back it up, factually, utilizing the standard, utilizing technology to actually prove out that theory that it works, you definitely know that it's something worthwhile. And I think that's what Fortinet honestly saw in the company. Obviously, there wasn't a big purchase price, a big fanfare when Fortinet bought them. But I think Fortinet's sitting on a little bit of wireless networking gold. It's just trying to figure out the usefulness of that moving forward in today's society with the number of devices that we have and the densities that we deal with, right? So.
Would you also say that it would also have to do with the knowledge people have of wireless? Do you think maybe it's because they don't fully understand how single channel architecture works?
Definitely. I think that there were a lot of misnomers about how Maru actually worked, right? A lot of people just looked at it as, it's a fad, it'll go and come. There's nothing technologically sound about it. It just can't work. It's not going to support things. And while obviously the days of, Maru, the heyday, if you will, of Maru is long past now, there were some very good use cases for the technology. I would still say to this day, even with things like, 802.11r and 802.11v, when it comes to voice roaming, there are very few things that could actually accomplish a roam from a VoIP device as smoothly and as quickly as Maru could, even to this day. So, now obviously we can't build a network just around, a handful of VoIP devices, right? But I do think that it was something at the time that was great, and even to this day would still work exceptionally well if we had enough spectrum to be able to dedicate just to that.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Well, hopefully we can hear more out of Fortinet when it comes to single channel architecture. But moving on to a different topic, one of the other reasons why we have you on the show is we want to talk about this new podcast that's coming out. Maybe you can shed some light to everyone here and bring on some new listeners, a new perspective. And this is why we really like the wireless community. So even though Scott, you're also a wireless guy coming out with your own wireless podcast, we're not shy to have you on the show and also, help promote others in our community and what they're doing. So why don't you go into what this new podcast is and where you want to go with it?
Absolutely. I appreciate the invite to be on Clear to Send, and obviously we'll reciprocate that back once our podcast is up and going. But I guess now by the time this airs, we'll be able hopefully to have our first episode published. I know we wrapped recording on that a few days ago. I'm just working on some final edits and all for it. But it's going to be called The Contention Window, and I'm actually going to have a co-host, and that co-host we actually just revealed earlier this week. And that would be Tawny Odia.
Nice.
Many of you may know Tawny as the marketing side of Ventive infrastructure. And I just thought that she would be a good fit for the show, bring a little bit of a lighter side to the podcast. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with Tawny, she's actually pursuing the CWNP program. I know she just completed her CWNA not that long ago. So she started down that path with the rest of us. And I think it'll be good to have her unique perspective, both as a vendor of wireless technology and a fellow fan of wireless tech in general.
Yeah, very familiar with Tawny, have seen her at every single conference. And I will say, do not discount Tawny because she's in marketing. She has her CWNA. She knows what she's talking about. And overall, she's just a great person. So, I mean, that's pretty awesome to have her on the podcast. And I think it will add a good dynamic between, you and Tawny, different perspectives as well. I think that's what's going to make the show pretty good. And I do love the title, Contention Window.
Yeah, it was one of those things. I joked with some of the guys that I'm friends with. You almost these days can just open up like a CWAP book, right, and look through it, try to find a a good title for a podcast, but thought it would be something a little bit different. Not necessarily pitching it as just a controversial show, if you will. But I think sometimes spinning up a little controversy in the industry creates some good dialogue that goes on between engineers. Just wanted to use it more as a platform to kind of present a few of the thoughts that run through my head on a day-to-day basis, and make it a little more fun and inviting than just text on a page of a blog. So I'm excited to see what happens with the podcast in 2019. And for those of you that are listening in the audience, I don't believe that the contention window will be the only new podcast in wireless coming out this year. So just a little hint there. Well, just a little teasing. We won't mention any names or anything, but just be on the lookout for another potential show coming out soon.
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to be great.
What did you guys talk about for the first episode?
Oh, now you're trying to get all the goods before we actually release. Okay.
You said it would be released by the time we release, right?
Yeah, depending on the release schedule, we'll probably be out there. But anyway, for the first episode, we're going to go into a little bit, I'll throw a little bit of mobile wireless at you, talking about a controversial subject that was really presented, if you will, in early 2018, talking about mapping data from the carriers and then how that's going to kind of relate to, or as how we see it relating to the potential for affecting 5G as well as home broadband and wireless networks moving forward. We're going to go a little bit, just kind of skim the surface a little bit about the FCC's release of the 6G or 6 gigahertz NPRM. And then we're going to close it out with some predictions, if you will, from Tani and I as to what we think is going to happen in wireless in 2019.
Awesome. So how often do you think you're going to release a new episode this year?
We're going to shoot for every 2 to 3 weeks initially. We may speed that up once we kind of get our podcasting legs under us. I know for both Tani and I, this is our first podcast, not to be on per se, but just our first podcast that we're actually running, producing, editing, and all. So it's been a big learning curve for us over the last few weeks, trying to get everything pulled together. The concept is actually one that I have been toying with in my head now, going back to probably mid-2018. I obviously have a very active blog. I try to post useful things on there that can help wireless engineers out there with a project that they're working on, present some good information as far as just general purpose knowledge about how wireless is working or what's going on in wireless. And obviously just listening to podcasts like Clear to Send and the Wireless LAN Professionals podcast that Keith and Matthew put out, just wanted to explore the platform, be able to put a little bit different spin on things, maybe stir up some discussion and dialogue and see what we can get out of it. Because obviously, Francois and Roel both, like you guys said, you can never have too many podcasts out there, right? So it'll be interesting.
Everyone has different opinions, so it's good to have conversation going around, especially with different podcasts. I think that it'll be an interesting landscape, as you can say, about wireless and how people think about it. So yeah, I mean, you and I could have completely different viewpoints on a topic, and we could share that on our own platforms and kind of go, hey, here's what Scott thinks, and here's what Roel thinks. Go listen to them.
Well, yeah, podcasting is I was going to say podcasting is another way of sharing, kind of like blogging. So you just like how we have different blogs with different bloggers with different view and opinions, you can have different podcasts with different styles and different opinions as well.
Absolutely. So secretly, we really wanted to create it just to compete with Clear to Send and be very controversial with you guys and all. But and all jokes aside, though, we love Clear to Send. We love you guys, and we would love nothing more than for your listeners to join our podcast and for ours to join Clear to Send as well. So I think there's plenty of airtime, for lack of a better wireless pun, right?
No pun intended.
Plenty of airtime for all of us out there, and it'll be exciting. I think we'll have some fun and maybe even have some crossover episodes maybe coming in the future.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Where can people find it once it's out?
So we're going to be on Apple Podcasts, obviously. You can reach us on the web at contentionwindow.com. You'll also be able to email us if you want to reach out via email, which is, I guess, kind of becoming like regular mail, right? It's kind of going the way of the dinosaur, but we're available via email at thecontentionwindow@gmail.com, or you can reach us on Twitter at _CW_podcast.
Awesome. All right, so let's go into transition to either, I guess the topic is either stadium or large public venue Wi-Fi, and your experience, since that's kind of your focus in that area, and more specifically, you're doing a lot of Aruba networks with large public venues. Is that right?
That's correct.
So when you approach, maybe you can use your last project as an example. How do you approach a large public venue, and from there, your design and implementation? Can you go into some of those details and what your thought process is there?
Sure. So absolutely. The first thing I do is, immediately start worrying, obviously. Anytime you dive off into a project as large as a stadium or, a large venue of any kind, whether it be an indoor arena, a large hospital facility, there's always unique challenges that each of these present. I think the unique thing about a stadium or an arena, if you will, is just the sheer openness of the space, right? Kind of unique in the aspect of there aren't many places that you're going to be operating let me rephrase it. There aren't many places that you're going to run a wireless network where you're going to have the opportunity to have, say, 10 to 20 or maybe even 60 or 70,000 people in one large contiguous open space, right? And when you then look at the underlying network and the things that all have to happen, sequentially and simultaneously to make the wireless network operate effectively and efficiently in a space like that, it's mind-boggling. Sometimes I sit back and I look at some of these large venues like Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta that uses Aruba Networks, and some of these other large facilities that just, vendor irrespective, right? And you think about the amount of planning that went into every single access point, and how if one of those access points fails in some of these systems, how that affects other access points around, and then how that affects the fan and user experience. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of moving pieces, as I like to say, in stadiums or arena wireless or LPV wireless, if you will, that all have to happen. And some of these have to happen months ahead of when you actually connect the first device to that stadium network.
So when you say moving pieces, do you have any specific examples in mind?
Well, obviously, it depends upon each venue. If you have a venue that is undergoing renovation, you're going to have a little bit different process than you would if you have a venue that's being built from the ground up, right? Because obviously, every time you go into a venue, let's just look at it from a new build, new construction, if you will, right? Nothing's in place. You have a lot more freedom of movement. You have a lot more freedom to use and try different things maybe while the stadium's coming out of the ground, versus a renovation that you may put the plan in place, the wireless design in place, 18, 20, maybe even 36 months or more ahead of when you actually turn up the network for the first time. And then along the way, there are going to be unique challenges that come up. And this is kind of the same, irrespective of if it's new construction or remodel of a venue. But there are going to be things that come up that you can't account for or plan for ahead of time, and that the construction crews and teams couldn't plan for either. So as much as we like to be wireless engineers and have everything very precise, very detail oriented when we put a plan in place for any of our networks. Sometimes at the end of the day, when you're in these venues, it comes down to more of wireless as an art form than it does wireless as a truly engineered, precise,
Yeah.
implemented feature, right?
So you're having a lot of limitation. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, there can be, right? Like,
Yeah.
you may have planned on putting, the APs that service a particular area in location A, but unfortunately, what you weren't aware of at the time was that there's, a 50-ton steel beam that's going to run through that area. So it doesn't quite equate for a good mounting option then for the access points. So you kind of have to move and kind of change on the fly and adapt to what's being presented while you kind of move through the building process.
When it comes to designing a stadium, obviously they're going to say, yeah, we get about 20, 30, you said up to 70,000 people. One of the things we talk about online all the time is gather requirements. What does gathering requirements look like for an environment where you don't know who's coming in, what kind of devices they're bringing in, but all you know is that they want the fan experience to be, phenomenal?
Top notch.
Yeah, so you kind of build a stadium a little bit differently than what you would a traditional network, right? Because when we're looking at something like a school or a hospital or something like that, you're pretty much going to know what your least capable but most important device is. You're going to be able to build those requirements based upon what their needs actually are. But like you said, when it comes to a stadium, it's pretty much, Mr. Customer, what are your requirements? The answer is, well, we want wireless for everybody. So you do your best to plan based on your previous experiences in the industry. I wouldn't say that stadiums by any means are one of those things that you would just dive off into as a wireless engineer without any experience working in one previously. Fortunately for myself, I've had some of that experience working in these large venues, done several things for a large cruise line industry over the years. Also had some time spent up in Washington, D.C. working on the Washington National Stadium back several years ago when it was Maru. So I've had that experience of troubleshooting and tackling issues, in that large open environment where you're supporting, 40,000 fans and you've got several hundred radios all within earshot of each other that all have to be operating. So, in perfect harmony, if you will, to be able to provide that great user experience. But when it comes to design of a stadium, I like to say that you can't really design a stadium without having faced those issues and troubleshooting stadiums before. I think those experiences help you kind of know what to look for, know what to plan for when it comes to design, what kind of capacities we're looking at, obviously, because when you look at a stadium, we're never going to build a stadium for 100% capacity, right? We typically look at that and we're going to pick a number. I typically shoot for around 70% of concurrent devices operating in a venue at any given time. And even then, right, that's just kind of a theoretical thing. That's based upon, just looking at things like what were some of the largest events that used wireless networks, like Super Bowls, for instance. I think the largest Super Bowl to date was somewhere around 45 to 48% take rate as far as concurrency goes during the event. So, for instance, if you have a 10,000 seat stadium or a 10,000 seat arena, you're never going to plan for 10,000 concurrent devices. You're going to plan for probably around 60 to 70%. And then in reality, you're probably actually only going to see around, say, 40 to 50% of those users actually online simultaneously. And those are the things that you have to know in order to build a functional network so that, when you get to day one of network operation, right, or event one, if you will, of network operation in an LPV, you don't have to be sitting on pins and needles, if you will, as to if the network's going to function.
So I have a question related to the capacity planning. So you're saying you're basing yourself on like a 60-70% of concurrent devices being connected to the Wi-Fi. What about the amount of traffic that those devices will generate? How do you estimate that for your capacity planning? Do you take that into account, or do you use your past experiences as well? Is it something you monitor during live events?
We do. You take a little bit of both, your past experiences and, kind of a prediction, if you will, set up a dartboard, throw a dart, pick a number, right, type thing. You kind of use all of that to form what you're actually going to be aiming for as far as the design capacity goes. Fortunately, the guys over at Aruba Networks have spent a substantial amount of time over the years putting together, I call it the VHD Bible. Chuck Legushevsky and those guys, right? Everybody, is familiar with Chuck. If not, you will be, or you're going to hopefully be Googling him right now. We won't try to spell his last name.
Yeah,
right?
if you can spell his last name, good luck.
We'll put a link in the description. That's way faster.
But Chuck and the team over at Aruba have spent a good bit of time putting together just a truly exceptional document that kind of helps step you through the thought process of design and planning of these large venues, right? They've done an exceptional amount of work, data collection in live venues over the years, and have been gracious enough, like many in the wireless community are, in sharing some of that data and research with us to allow us to take that then and kind of build upon it and implement networks of similar scale and nature, if you will. But as far as, overall throughput and all like that, not typically something that I focus on a lot. Fortunately, when you look at the wireless network inside a venue, you're really limited by the available spectrum that we have to work with.
Yeah, that's going to be a limitation. Yeah.
It is. And because that RF can only carry a finite amount of data, right? There's only so much that you can do with it. Yeah. So, and there's only so much data and throughput that it's going to carry. So essentially, you can build a little calculator. I've got a spreadsheet that I've put together that takes into account some of the information that Chuck and the team have shared in the VHD deployment guide, and then kind of made a few tweaks and spins on that over the years to kind of help estimate where I think we'll be from a throughput standpoint, and then a lot of the little lesser known things that typically people forget to focus on when it comes to bringing a venue like this online. Things like DHCP and DNS, right? The fundamentals, if you will, of networking. If you don't take those into account, if you don't know what you're going to be potentially expecting from a DNS queries per second, if you will, then you're have a large percentage chance of failure, not in the wireless network, but right at that fundamental network foundation level before you. So those are the things that you have to look at. But throughput, generally, like I said, from an RF perspective, it's self-limiting, if you will, which is also another reason why when you're doing venues and networks like this, we don't try to put any kind of rate limits or throughput caps in place, right? Because we don't need them.
Yeah, there's no need for any of that. And I would even imagine in a large public venue, that's not a big concern, which is throughput of maybe a mobile device, right?
Yeah, it's really not. If you look at some of the information that I was looking at recently was roughly 75% of wireless frames are under 256 bytes in size, right? Just extremely small. But there's an exceptional number of those being transmitted simultaneously, especially in something like a venue. But if you look at a lot of these stadiums, and let's just say there's 60,000 spectators in the stands, most of the devices are going to sit there idle a good percentage of the time. And when they're not idle, it's a momentary ping, right, from an app on the phone that's just saying, "Hey, I'm here. Hey, I'm here," right? Almost like a, "Hey, do you have any info for me?" Right, in a DTEM or something. But so we don't typically focus around large simultaneous throughputs. But it is something that you need to be aware of, right? So that you have, the 10 gig backbone in place, from closet to closet, from IDF to MDF, and then out to your internet uplink. You have to focus on, the burstability nature of your ISP uplinks to be able to handle those momentary bursts of traffic. All those things do come into account, but from a wireless network design standpoint, right? Those are kind of things that we're going to get you on and off the air as quickly as we can. And when we look at the amount of traffic typically generated on average, you're really only going to see maybe, half a meg to a meg of throughput out of device at any given moment.
What type of application have you seen being used by your customers in stadium and arenas? Because I've talked to a couple of people, and I've seen clubs or stadiums launching their own app, and then they can replay some of the the goals or whatever is happening during the games directly to the fan, and enhancing the fan experience. But everything is going over the Wi-Fi. Have you seen any of those new style application leveraging the Wi-Fi in the stadium?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the showpiece, if you will, of Aruba Networks venues would be the San Francisco 49ers Stadium out in Santa Clara. Those guys have worked with a company called Venue Next to develop exactly what you're talking about, right? An app that it does everything from show you what the current score, time of possession, all the detailed stats, to giving you, instantaneous highlights of a play, or, hey, what's the queue line time at concession stand 123? And now you're even starting to see those applications expand further to really truly becoming the one interface for the venue with the fan, going all the way from prior to the event, dispatching tickets through that application, to utilizing it then to get into the gate, giving them instructions on maybe where they're looking to go at from a spectator standpoint of, hey, I want to make sure I visit this particular section of the stadium or see that while I'm there, to ordering food in the seat. So we're continuing to put more and more onto our wireless networks and depend more and more heavily upon those for a useful and exceptional fan experience in these venues. And then I think, I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier about talking about the NPRM with the FCC and 6 gigahertz. Definitely from the perspective of someone that works in a stadium, we need more spectrum. We'll take everything that you can give us, and anything that you can give us, I'm sure we'll consume. So I think in another, say, 12 to probably 24 months, once that the 6 gigahertz release has hopefully been approved and happened, and then you start seeing some of these venues turn over, to the next generation of equipment that's able to support it. Hopefully by that
6.
time, Wi-Fi 6, maybe
6.5.
or 5.5, right? I don't really know where to call it. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with that release and how that continues to improve the performance of wireless networks in large venues.
So what about 2.4 in a stadium? Do you even care about it, or what do you do? So
from the 2.4 perspective, this is actually, it's fun. I had this controversial subject on Twitter not that long ago. I am one of those that I absolutely believe that there is usefulness in 2.4. Now, how much usefulness? It depends. I always like to tell people, your mileage may vary by using 2.4 in general, but especially into a stadium. But there actually are usefulness. There actually is, usefulness for 2.4 gigahertz in a stadium. The one that we brought online back in December. I know I was monitoring some of the statistics from the first few games there, and we were looking at roughly, I think out of 2,500 connections, I think I had somewhere around 30 that were 2.4 11G only stations.
Okay.
So
From the fans?
From the fans, yeah. So
okay.
obviously, you try to push everyone to 5 gigahertz if you can. You would love if you could just shut 2.4 gig off sometimes.
Just
but
not quite there yet.
We're just not there yet. And if you look at it, right, if we're really only pushing, 500K or a megabit per second from some of these devices, that's 600K per second that you might be able to squeeze out of 2.4 gig is very useful, right? I mean, you could support a few more additional fans on every access point that otherwise may have a poor experience or no experience at all, right? Because they weren't able to connect if it was 5 gigahertz only.
Well, when it comes to the configuration of these large public venues, how does Aruba Networks do it differently? And what are some of the configurations that you definitely use to help tune the environment?
So within Aruba, depend a lot upon client match within venues. The ability to tune client match to help move stations around to the better access point, if you will, the less used spectrum. Those things are vital in helping increase connectivity in venues.
And for those of those who don't know what client match is that load balancing?
Not really load balancing per se. Client match is kind of Aruba's proprietary technology. It monitors a myriad of stats from the network throughout the connection and it then uses those statistics from what's going on that access point and others around, and then what the device itself that's connecting is capable of connecting over to move that device around to kind of help nudge it to the better access point, so that you're always maintaining a high SNR, if you will, or you're maintaining a great connection because, hey, we don't really need to put you on this radio that has 50 people on it, but we want to kind of move you over here to this one that's less used. You'll have a better experience, even though that one that's less used may not necessarily be, from an RSSI perspective, the most appropriate one that you would think you would want to connect to.
Gotcha. Okay. What other benefits do you get out of Aruba Networks? Because I do see a lot of Aruba Networks in high density areas and large public venues. So it's definitely a vendor a lot of people like to go to. So I'm thinking there's probably some settings that give you some sort of advantage to tuning in the area.
Well, I think fundamentally wireless is wireless at the end of the day, right? I wouldn't necessarily say that there's any kind of secret sauce or special feature necessarily that I would use to improve an Aruba network over someone else.
Sauce there.
But I think a lot of what helps push Aruba to the front of mind from some of these venue owners and stakeholders when they're looking at evaluating companies for who they want to choose to implement the network. The experience of the team over at Aruba, the amount of information that they have to draw on from past experiences, from things that they've tested over the years, I think definitely helps kind of push Aruba forward in front of some of the other more traditional wireless companies. And then there's a lot of little things that I personally never would have really thought would affect vendor selection or how well the wireless network performs. But when we talk about things that Aruba does from a testing perspective, right, they've done some exceptional in-depth work around the propagation of wireless signals through concrete of varying ages. So, right, that's not something that you typically think about. Well, why do I really care how wireless propagates through concrete? But when we start looking at these structures, right, sometimes in the early days, the thought process was, well, we're in an open air stadium. We don't really have anywhere in line of sight above ground to position access points to provide the cell size and the capacity and performance that we need. So let's look at going underneath, right? This kind of even predates under seat, if you will, which I would say would be directly beneath the seating, but on top of the concrete decking. The initial way that we were providing coverage in some of these venues was to shoot it with patch antennas through the concrete. So things like the propagation characteristics of a 5 gigahertz signal through a concrete port in 1945 is not something that I, as a wireless engineer, would ever think would matter, but it does. And it was useful to those guys in the early networks. And then they kind of have taken that over the years, the evolution of the arena or the stadium network, right? And it's moved from that to we try to position things overhead, line of sight in front of the user. So it's essentially hitting the signal, it's hitting the user in the face to make sure that we can maintain high SNR. Or in the case of a venue like a 70,000 seat football stadium. And I think it's actually funny because football works in both characteristics, right? The context could be either football as we know it in the U.S. or football as we may know it overseas.
Francois football.
Yeah, it's all football, right? So when we look at, an arena with 70,000 people, we think, well, if we can't position overhead, what's the next best option? So we want to try to get that signal as close to the user as we can to increase that SNR and provide that better experience. So we go under seat now, and I think we're at the point where we've kind of settled, if you will, as an industry of we're going to go under seat or we're going to go overhead as our two best options. I know a lot of times you'll see some handrail type deployments, if you will. I think those are useful in certain instances where you're looking at maybe only, say, 10 spectators away from the access point on a horizontal axis, being able to use that effectively. But from some testing that we've seen done, once you really cross that 10-person mark, that signal starts to fall off pretty rapidly, and that experience decreases then with that fall off. So I'm not a big proponent of handrail stuff, but I do think in some cases there is usefulness around that.
Okay. Francois, you got any? Yeah, go ahead, Francois.
No, I had one question related to, monitoring a live event. What type of metric do you look at when you monitor a live event? And what would be like a red flag for you?
Red flag is the venue personnel come running towards you. And, anytime, anytime you see that, it's probably not going to end well. But we look at different things, right? We look at number of connections per access point radio. We look at what the channel utilization is in a particular area. We look at what is our overall throughput through the area, right? I've had instances where IT personnel have come to me, during an event or after an event saying, look, we know there's something wrong in this section. There has to be because nobody connected, right? But then you go and you test and everything works fine. So, I think there's times where as a wireless engineer, we almost get too dependent upon monitoring. But, just kind of from a fundamental level, right? We want to make sure that our access points aren't going over a certain number of connections. We're going to want to make sure that our channel utilization is an acceptable range. And, again, one of those your mileage may vary things, right? Channel utilization being high is not necessarily a bad thing, especially in venues like this. I can almost guarantee you that you're going to see a elevated channel utilization occur in venues. Sometimes even if the event has not even started or is hours away from starting. Things like what network is broadcasting. And when I say network broadcasting, I'm not talking about the wireless network in this perspective, right?
Like
I'm talking about
exactly.
I'm talking about television networks. So, for instance, several years ago, working one of the playoff games in Washington, D.C. for Major League Baseball, about an hour prior to actual start of the game, I saw 5 gigahertz utilization in Uni 3 go up to 100% and sit there for the entire event. 30 minutes after the event ended, back to nothing. And, you're scratching your head going, what in the world is going on? And you start looking around, and after some digging, what we discovered was that at the time, the transmitter packs for the wireless cameras that the television network was using for the broadcast operated in Uni 3 spectrum. So for the entire duration of the game, if you were an AP on a Uni 3 channel, your experience was pretty poor.
And that sounds like a challenge in your stadium deployments. What are other challenges that you face that are those that are memorable?
Those that are memorable. That's going to be a tough one. I try to block out the memorable ones because the memorable ones usually probably didn't end well. I think the biggest thing that you worry about, especially at some venues, is age of the infrastructure itself. We do a lot of retrofits coming into venues that say are 20, 30 years or more in age. You can't really account for, even with best effort planning, that concession stand worker that's going to plug in that bun warmer to an outlet that just happens to be on the same circuit as the IDF that supports half of the stadium. I'm glad that you got a warm hamburger. Don't complain that your wireless went out because but there's things like that you can't account for, right? The professional venues most often have a frequency coordinator that is responsible for monitoring and maintaining who uses what frequencies out of the spectrum, both from from a wireless network standpoint in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, all the way down to things like CB walkie-talkie communication. All of those have to be registered beforehand. Not saying that they always get registered.
Because you can
probably see where I'm going with this.
Even in the unlicensed spectrum, they'll try to monitor that or.
Well, monitor, yes. Obviously, when you get into licensed spectrum, if you hold a license for it, you can't tell them they can't use it. But they just try to keep a handle on who's using what to prevent overlap as much as possible. Because when you look at these so let's take a large event like the Super Bowl, for instance. You're not talking about just the normal day-to-day personnel that are on hand, right? From a security standpoint, from a vendor standpoint, from a television standpoint, from a wireless IT standpoint, right? You've got a lot of additional personnel that are brought in from the various security agencies, for instance, that are all going to need a certain channel to talk on for communication purposes. You've got TV networks that have paid, millions, if not billions of dollars to these professional sports leagues and teams to own the rights to broadcast that event. So, in the case of the playoff game that I mentioned earlier, it's not like I could just go up to, the TV network and say, hey, you're using my space, get off of it.
Right.
Unfortunately, there are circumstances where the fan experience is superseded by something else. and in that case, right, multiples of dollars that are being handed out for being able to show that event to people around the world. So you just kind of have to do what you can to mitigate that. In that particular instance, there were times where we would try to make in-game changes, maybe move away from, if we see that for some reason there's something in channel, 60 that we can't figure out what's going on, and that's a channel that we need to operate on. Maybe it's a back of house channel that we've reserved for guaranteed access to media or something, right? Yeah. Those are things that you kind of have to think about, like how is the network going to be used? We know we have media that are going to covering us. We want to provide those users a good experience no matter what. So we're going to take that channel off the board. So now we just went from 24 usable 5 gigahertz channels, if we include DFS, down to 23. Okay. Then we've got, say, VIP networks that we're going to need to make sure that they stay on for, either team owners or coaching staffs for on-field communication with tablets that you use these days, for instance, things like that. Okay. Well, there goes 2 or 3 more channels, right? Yeah. So you start quickly eliminating channels that you really can't afford, if you will, as a wireless engineer to give up to be able to support the network. So sometimes we have to kind of work around those on the fly, if you will. Typically, I try not to make changes to my venue networks. I institute, if you will, kind of a self-imposed blackout period a few hours before to a few hours afterwards, unless you get that one instance, right, where the stadium personnel come running towards you because something's down completely.
Yeah, and it's not entirely uncommon to do a channel plan where you dedicate a channel to something very specific, but I guess in a stadium, there's a lot more to consider, right? You got like you said, your VIPs and your reporters, your media, and then all the channels that you can reuse starts dwindling. And so at a large public venue, I guess that's at a much larger scale. Whereas maybe in my environment, I'm dedicating one channel for something like that, and I still have 23, 24 channels to pick from. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something to think about when it comes to stadium deployments. And to round out the show here, we're already approaching, I guess we're at the 1 hour mark. To end the show, what are the things that you did right in these deployments?
Did right. Well, I guess the event, when event 1 happens, you're pretty uptight. Even if you've been doing this for a number of years and this is your, 20 millionth stadium, you always worry about event 1 and how it goes. So when you can complete event 1 and maybe even season 1 in some of these venues without any major meltdowns or major complaints, you take that as a win. I think a lot of what I've done in stadiums over the years, I kind of look back on and sometimes you wonder, how in the world did that actually work? You just sometimes get lucky. And that goes back to the wireless as an art form sometimes in stadiums more so than it is a calculated, engineered, planned thing. Mm-hmm. But, just being able to carry the load in a stadium, knowing how many potential users you're going to have on, and being able to have people come to you at the end of the event or something and say, hey, network worked great. Didn't have any problems. The concessionaires were able to get their orders placed. The fans had a good time. We saw a lot of, traffic from social media in use on the network throughout the event. Those are the things that you kind of look for to know that you did things right.
You did right, yeah.
Not saying that there aren't things that you could always improve on, but that's kind of the gold standard is when you can walk away from an event with a positive experience from your fans.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great way to end the show here. Scott, I want to thank you for sharing your experience when it comes to stadium deployments and talking about how you used Aruba Networks there. And because I know you're quite the expert on Aruba Networks, and I've asked you a few questions on Slack about Aruba, and always enjoy the our conversations that we have when it comes to specific vendor configurations. But I want you to tell everyone where they can find you. I know you have a great blog. You share a lot of good information there. So go ahead and share that with everyone, as well as your Twitter and, again, your podcast.
Sure. So you can follow me on my blog. It's https://blog.theitrebel.com. You can follow me on Twitter at @theitrebel. And feel free to hit me up via either the blog contact form or my Twitter, and I'll be glad to kind of spread some wireless knowledge and help you out however I can.
Awesome. And then the podcast is contentionwindow.com, right?
Yep, contentionwindow.com. Hopefully we'll be releasing here in the coming days, and looking for good things to come out of that in 2019.
Awesome. Well, great job on getting a new blog launched, and it's going to be a fun process. It's hard at first, but it gets better and easier as time goes on, and you'll find those efficiencies, because I've gone through that. Francois knows as well, and just keep it easy, and the topics will come to you, and I'm sure it'll be a great podcast. So I want to thank you for joining us here on the show, and look forward to hearing more from you. And if anyone wants to ask questions, you can head over to the show notes. Just head over to cleartosend.net and look for Scott Lester, Stadium Wi-Fi using Aruba Networks. And with that, I want to let you guys off, and hopefully you enjoy this episode. Share it with your friends, your colleagues, or whoever you think might find this useful, and we'll see you at the next episode. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.